Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where every cheer could be your last, where sand drinks blood before noon, and where your fame, your future, even your heartbeat all depend on how well you fight while half naked in front of 50,000 screaming Romans. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn strange, brutal history while winding down, go ahead and hit that like button. And if stories like this keep your eyes wide at midnight, you might want to subscribe. Just saying. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and picture this. You're standing in the belly of the Colosseum. You can't see the crowd yet, but you hear them. A pulsing wall of noise boots stomping, horns blaring, vendors shouting. The air smells like sweat, metal, and stale wine. You're shaking, not from cold, but from the knowledge that in the next few minutes, someone will try to kill you fast, dirty, and in full view of a bloodthirsty empire. You're new, a rookie, fresh meat. They barely bothered to give you a name. Above you, the gates crank open. Sunlight pours down like judgment. You squint. The sand is blinding white. Somewhere up there, nobles are laughing, pointing. Senators placing bets. The emperor, maybe even Commodus himself, watching from the imperial box, deciding if your death will be breakfast, entertainment, or just background noise. You step into the arena. Across from you, a veteran gladiator, taller, heavier, calmer, taps his blade against his shield like a man knocking at death's door just to see who's home. He has done this before. Your legs are jelly, your stomach clenches, but your hand knows what to do. You've trained for this. You raise your sword. The crowd hushes. And then the horn sounds. Steel meets steel. Dust flies. Every strike is a gamble. Every breath could be your last. There's no room for hesitation. No second takes. No help coming. But somehow you survive. Just barely. You stand bloodied, exhausted, and dazed. Your opponent lies still. The crowd erupts. Now you wait. The editor, the game master, steps forward. He looks to the crowd. Then, slowly, he looks at you. Will it be mercy or death? That's your welcome to the world of the gladiators, where survival was a spectacle, pain was a profession, and the only certainty was that everything you had could be taken with a thumb. But to understand how someone ends up standing in an arena like this facing death in front of an emperor, we need to start earlier, much earlier. Because before you could fight, before you could kill, you had to be bought. Before the roar of the crowd, before the first drop of blood hit the sand, there was a deal, a transaction, and you were the product. Gladiators didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were bought, traded, owned. If you were unlucky, you were sold into it. If you were desperate, you signed up. And if you were already a slave, you didn't get a vote. The place where this began was the slave market, a chaos of chained limbs, auctioneers, and curious buyers fingering muscle like they were picking out meat. Imagine being yanked out of your homeland, branded like livestock, and then lined up for inspection, teeth checked, scars noted, eyes tested for obedience. Among the bidders were the Lannistae, the managers of gladiator schools. They were part recruiter, part investor, part mob boss. A good Lanista knew how to spot potential. Strong back, fast reflexes, rage behind the eyes. But most of all, someone with nothing to lose. Because the truth was brutal. Gladiators were expensive to train, feed, house, and heal. Lannistae didn't want cowards. They wanted killers. Even better, volunteers. Yes, some men actually chose this life. Poor freemen, ex-soldiers, runaways, even aristocrats, fallen on hard times. They signed contracts, swore oaths, and became octorati free men who willingly became gladiators. Why? Money, glory, escape, or maybe just the twisted promise of being remembered. A successful gladiator could earn prizes, women, fame. A few even won their freedom. But first, they had to survive the ludus. The ludus wasn't just a school. It was a meat grinder, an ironclad system that took slaves, volunteers, and rejects and turned them into weapons. Picture it, stone barracks locked from the outside, straw pallets, iron chains, guards who didn't smile. Your name was replaced with a number. You weren't a man. You were an asset. Morning started before sunrise. Warm-ups weren't optional. You ran, you drilled, you sweated through layers of dust and discipline. And the weapon you trained with? It wasn't real. Not at first. You were handed a ludus, a wooden sword, heavier than steel. Why? Because if you could master the fake sword, the real one would feel like an extension of your arm. Or so they said. Your instructors weren't gentle. They were often ex-gladiators themselves, covered in scars, missing fingers, silent and brutal. You learned to fight in styles. Murmillo with a gladius and tower shield. Thrax, fast and flashy, with a curved blade and high crest. Retiarius, armed only with a trident and net, almost naked, but deadly. And you didn't get to choose. The lanista chose for you, based on your size, your speed, your body type. Some styles were more popular. Some were considered weak. But the audience decided what you were worth. And the audience was fickle. And here's the twist. The training was brutal, but weirdly scientific. Instructors counted blows, timed dodges, studied footwork. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Violence as performance, death as rhythm. But for every man who learned to strike, someone else never made it to the arena at all. Some died in training. Some broke bones and were discarded. Others snapped under pressure and were thrown into warm-up matches that were really just public executions. Because the ludus didn't waste time on weakness. Still, if you survived long enough, something strange started to happen. You got stronger, faster, smarter. You began to anticipate strikes, move with fluidity, learn your opponent's tells, and maybe, just maybe, you started to like it. Not the pain, not the killing, but the clarity, the purpose, the strange, sharp honor of knowing exactly what you were, and exactly what the world expected from you. And for the first time in your life, the crowd might remember your name. But that name came with a weapon and a role. And those roles, they weren't just styles. They were stories. To understand why each gladiator was more than a fighter, why he was a walking myth, we need to talk about the armor, the weapons, and the identity they forced you to wear. Because in Rome, you weren't just fighting for survival. You were fighting to become a character the people would cheer for or against. The moment you step into the arena, you are not you anymore. You are a type, a living mask, a role scripted not by playwrights, but by tradition, spectacle, and violence. Rome didn't just want death, it wanted theater. That's why every gladiator had a costume, a class, a combat style, and each one meant something. Were you a Murmillo? Then you fought like a tank-heavy shield, gladius sword, full helmet with a fish-like crest. You were slow, armored, relentless, a walking wall of Roman might. Were you a Thrax? You wore a smaller curved sword and a wide-brimmed helmet with griffin wings. Your armor covered your legs but left your chest exposed. You were flashy, nimble, a show-off meant to impress the crowd with spins and speed. Were you a Retiarius? Then you were practically naked. You held a net and a trident, no shield, no helmet. You were the underdog, the rogue, the swimmer from the docks, turned killer. Your job was to frustrate and dance, dodging the slow-footed tank until you could land a single, lethal jab. Each role was designed to clash with another. Murmillo versus Retiarius, Thrax versus Secutor, big and armored versus fast and exposed. It wasn't just random, it was curated. Balanced like chess pieces. If you were too evenly matched, it got boring. If you were too mismatched, the crowd lost interest. And the crowd? They had favorites. Some cheered for the heavy, disciplined warriors, the ones who stood their ground and hacked methodically. Others screamed for the nimble tricksters, the ones who fought dirty, used feints, and turned the tide at the last second. That's why your weapon wasn't just a weapon, it was your brand. Even the armor was designed for show. The helmets were ornate not just for protection, but for drama. Crests, feathers, strange grins carved into metal. And every fighter's gear shone under the sunlight, polished to a glare. The crowd had to see you clearly from every tier. Because the audience was part of the game, they didn't want confusion. They wanted archetypes, characters, heroes and villains. They wanted to root for someone or boo them into the dirt. And sometimes the roles flipped. Maybe you were a provocator, an aggressor, who fought only other provocators in matches designed for violence without much art. You were a brute, a crowd favorite when they wanted blood. Or maybe you fought as an equites, mounted on horseback at the start, riding with lances before dismounting to finish the fight with a gladius. These were often the opening acts, cavalry duels, to warm up the audience. Sometimes you didn't fight men at all. Some gladiators were assigned to face wild animals, lions, bears, crocodiles. Others were forced into mock battles, playing the part of conquered peoples dressed like Celts or Gauls or Ethiopians, meant to lose for the sake of Roman pride. You weren't just fighting, you were performing Rome itself. But while the weapons and roles were scripted, the pain was real. That net, it could entangle you just long enough for the trident to pierce your side. That heavy shield, it could knock out teeth if it caught you wrong. That helmet with the narrow eye slits, it protected your skull, but it made it hard to see the blade swinging for your throat. And every combination of fighters was meant to test something: strength versus speed, reach versus agility, brute force versus clever footwork. You were the test subject, the hypothesis, the sacrifice. And if you died, you were replaced, easily. But if you survived, if you started to win, then your name started to circulate. People painted your face on pottery. Merchants sold tiny figurines of your likeness. Women sent letters. Children copied your moves with wooden swords in alleyways. Rome didn't care if you had been a slave, a criminal, or a prisoner of war. If you won enough, you became someone. But all of this depended on something most gladiators never got to control: what went into their bodies. Because even before the fight, you had to eat like a champion. You can't fight on an empty stomach, but you also can't fight on a full one. And if you're a gladiator, what you eat isn't about pleasure, it's about survival. The Roman public saw you as a beast of blood and strength, a muscle-bound icon of death. So, naturally, you were expected to look the part: massive, bulky, intimidating. And that required a very particular kind of fuel. Forget roasted boar and honey cakes. Gladiators ate like living machines. And their diet? It was weirdly plant-based. That's right, the most feared killers in the ancient world were basically ancient carb loaders. They were called hordiri, literally, barley men, because the bulk of their calories came from barley porridge, thick, heavy, and filling. Not glamorous, not exotic, but it got the job done. Barley was cheap, it was dense, and it gave you bulk. Combine that with beans, lentils, flatbread, and the occasional handful of dried fruit, and you had the ideal mix for building weight, not lean muscle, but mass. Gladiators didn't want six-packs. They wanted padding. Why? Because a thicker layer of fat actually protected vital organs in the arena. A deep cut to the abdomen was less likely to be fatal if there was a cushion in the way. It also made wounds more dramatic, more blood, less death. more cheers, fewer funerals. The audience got their gore, and the fighter got a second chance. They also drank a strange post-training beverage, a calcium-rich tonic made of charred bone ash and vinegar. Yes, really. Archaeological studies of gladiator bones in places like Ephesus show unusually high calcium levels, probably from this bone drink. It was like ancient Gatorade. If Gatorade tasted like burnt ribs and sour wine. Protein? It wasn't totally absent. Some gladiators got meat, usually scraps, offcuts, or boiled organs. Eggs, cheese, and fish were rare luxuries. But you didn't need steak. You needed stamina. Endurance. The ability to fight for minutes at a time under the hot sun while swinging a sword that weighed more than your head. And believe it or not, diet wasn't the only way gladiators bulked up. Some historians suggest they were given herbal supplements, things like fenugreek or dried figs to improve digestion, boost testosterone, or reduce inflammation. Others think some Laniste experimented with early performance enhancers concoctions that made fighters recover faster or hit harder. But the goal was always the same: keep them alive, keep them dangerous, and keep them marketable. Because by the time you were eating from the ludus rations, you were already an investment. Someone had paid money for you, trained you, armed you. You were the prize animal in Rome's greatest circus. And if you ate well enough to win, you earned more than just muscle. You earned the respect of your brothers and the fear that one day soon you'd have to fight one of them. Because inside those locked barracks, gladiators were a family. A family forged by sweat, steel, and the constant threat of betrayal. The ludus wasn't just a place of training. It was a cage, a pressure cooker, a home you never asked for, filled with people you couldn't trust but might die for anyway. Picture it. 24 men, all crammed into shared quarters. Some were Gauls, others Greeks. Some barely spoke Latin, some didn't speak at all. They came from different tribes, different continents, different crimes, but they all shared one thing, the same fate. They would fight. And one day, they might fight each other. It sounds like a recipe for chaos, and sometimes it was. Fistfights broke out. Words turned to blades. Jealousies brewed. But something else grew there too. Brotherhood. Not everyone gets this part of the story. Gladiators weren't wild animals. They weren't brainless killers. They were soldiers, teammates, sometimes even friends. And that made everything more complicated. Because when you live, train, and bleed beside someone every day, you learn how they move. You hear them cry out in the night from old wounds. You share food. You laugh. You bury the ones who don't make it. So what happens when the match is scheduled, and it's you versus him? What do you do when the friend who shared his last piece of bread is suddenly the one trying to crack your skull with a hammer? Sometimes they refused to fight, refused to kill each other. And when they did, the crowd turned on them. Booze rained down. Rotten fruit flew. The editor might even send in soldiers to punish them for denying the people their show. Because the crowd didn't want friendship. It wanted drama. Still, that bond forged in pain never really went away. Some gladiators formed collegia, informal burial societies where they pooled money to ensure each other got proper funerals. Even in a world where death was theater, they wanted dignity at the end. Others carved graffiti on ludus walls, short poems, nicknames, crude jokes, even sketches of their fellow fighters. One reads, "Crescens, net fighter beloved of all, he made the sand sing." Another? "Flamma, fourth-time champion, rejected his freedom 4 times." Why would anyone do that? Why refuse the wooden sword of release? Because out there, beyond the arena, they were nobodies again. In the arena, they were gods. Cheered, worshipped, admired. Inside the sand, they had purpose. Outside, just another broken man. And still, that camaraderie wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. Some fighters hated each other. Some bribed their way to better matches. Some trained in secret, hoarded tricks, lied to the younger recruits. Trust was rare, precious, dangerous, because every friend was also a future opponent. Every laugh could turn to blood. And yet, they shared everything. Wounds, victories, nightmares. When one died, the others carried the body. When one survived, they cheered from the shadows. And if a champion rose someone who kept winning, kept surviving, he became more than just a peer. He became a legend. But even legends bowed to the true master of the games, the crowd. Because no matter how strong you were, how clever, how ruthless, the final judge always sat not on a throne, but in the bleachers. And sometimes, 1,000 strangers decided if you lived or died. You could survive a sword to the leg. You could survive a spear to the ribs. But you couldn't survive a bored crowd. The arena wasn't just a battleground. It was a stage. And the audience? They weren't passive. They were predators. Tens of thousands of Romans packed the Colosseum and amphitheaters across the empire. Their eyes locked on the sand, their emotions swinging with every blow. They didn't just watch the games, they decided them. You could feel it, the shift in the air. One moment they're silent, holding their breath as a net wraps around a retreating Murmillo. The next, a wall of screams, demanding blood. And when a fighter fell to the ground, wounded and vulnerable, that's when the real contest began. Not between the combatants, but between life and death, mercy and execution. And the one who decided wasn't always the editor or the emperor. It was often the mob. They would chant, point, boo. Some called for mercy. Others screamed for the finishing blow. And all eyes would turn to the man in the high-backed chair, the editor. His job was to interpret the crowd, read their mood, respond to their bloodlust. A turned thumb didn't always mean death. That's a modern myth. But there were signals, sometimes subtle, sometimes unmistakable. If the crowd was silent, that was bad. If they turned their heads, worse. But if they leaned forward, eyes wide, mouths open, you knew you were giving them what they came for. And if the fallen man had fought well, shown skill, bravery, maybe taken a brutal hit and kept swinging, the crowd might shout, "Mitte!" Spare him. But if he had fought cowardly, tried to run, or embarrassed himself, they'd scream, "Ugula!" Finish him. You'd look up. The editor would raise his hand, pause, then give the signal, life or death. And the standing gladiator, he had to obey, whether he wanted to or not. Because in the arena, the real power didn't belong to the fighters. It belonged to the watchers. And Rome watched everything. That's why so many fighters developed personas, stylized movements, signature taunts. Some played the villain sneering, arrogant, ruthless. Others played the underdog clever, fast, defiant to the end. It wasn't just combat, it was character. And the crowd had favorites. Graffiti on Roman walls still shows names scratched into stone. Celidus, the Thracian, the girl's heartthrob. Crescens, the people's net thrower. Verus, undefeated and adored. Some gladiators had fan clubs. Others had stalkers. All of them were judged not just by their record, but by their performance. Because to the Roman people, a fight wasn't just about who lived. It was about who earned it. But the ones who watched weren't all equal. If you really wanted to survive, you didn't just need the crowd's favor. You needed something or someone far more dangerous on your side. You needed the politicians. The deeper you go into the world of gladiators, the more you realize it was never just about fighting. It was about power, about politics. And for Rome's elite, blood wasn't just entertainment, it was leverage. Hosting gladiator games was one of the fastest ways for a politician to rise in public favor. You could run for office with a mediocre record, a forgettable name, and still win if you gave the people a good enough show. That's how Julius Caesar did it. Long before he became dictator, he bankrupted himself funding massive public games, days and days of combat, wild animal hunts, even staged naval battles. He lost money, yes, but he gained something better: loyalty. The people loved him. They chanted his name. They remembered him. In Rome, throwing games wasn't a cost, it was an investment. Every senator knew it. Every aspiring consul understood it. If you wanted power, real power, you had to feed the people. And the people were always hungry for blood. So imagine being a gladiator in that system. You weren't just a fighter, you were campaign material, a walking advertisement, a vote-winning stunt. You might be selected to fight in a special match not because you deserved it, but because your death would be timely. Maybe your owner wanted to impress a magistrate. Maybe your school had a contract with a wealthy sponsor. Maybe you were the right size and style for a themed reenactment of a Roman victory. Suddenly, you're not a man anymore. You're a message. Even emperors played the game. Caligula once interrupted a match to demand a new fight on the spot just because he got bored. Commodus, notoriously, fought in the arena himself dressed as Hercules, wielding a club, killing wounded animals and disabled men for applause. He once demanded payment for each appearance. How much? 1,000,000 sesterces per fight, from the state treasury. For him, it wasn't about money. It was about ego. Because when an emperor enters the arena, it stops being a game. It becomes a stage for divine theater. And who could challenge that? Not the Senate. Not the editors. Not the gladiators, either. If you were chosen to spar with the emperor, you knew the rules: let him win, or die painfully. Some emperors showed mercy. Others treated gladiators like moving props. But all of them understood the games were the pulse of the people. If the arena cheered for you, the empire would follow. It worked both ways, too. Gladiators could become political symbols, their victories co-opted, their names used in speeches. One fighter's reputation could tilt a vote. Another's defiance could cause riots. And if a match went badly, if the crowd hated what they saw, the backlash could be brutal. There were moments in Roman history when games sparked uprisings, when rigged fights led to protests, when a single unjust execution made the people turn on the elite. Because if the crowd felt lied to, if they smelled manipulation, they responded with rage. Bread and circuses might pacify a population, but if the circus loses its honesty, the bread starts tasting like ash. So even the politicians had to walk a fine line. And for the gladiators, they had to be perfect. Always on, always performing. Not just for their lives, but for someone else's future. But not everyone in that arena was male. And not every roar from the crowd came from blood alone. Because sometimes the ones stepping into the sand were women. And when they did, Rome couldn't look away. You don't often hear about them. But they were there beneath the same sun, standing on the same blood-soaked sand. Women. Gladiators. Known as gladiatrices, they were rare, scandalous, and unforgettable. They fought not because it was expected, but because it shocked. And Rome, a city addicted to spectacle, could never resist a little scandal. These women weren't trained in large numbers. There were no massive schools for female fighters. They didn't flood the arenas. But when they did appear, they made waves that rippled all the way to the Senate floor. Some were slaves. Some were freed women. Some might have volunteered, drawn to the arena for the same reasons as the men: freedom, glory, or simply because there was no better option. But make no mistake, their presence was not about equality. It was about novelty. Romans craved surprise. And what could be more surprising than a woman, armed and armored, defeating a man before tens of thousands? There are records of them. In the writings of Suetonius, in mosaics and statues, one carved relief even shows two women, Amazonia and Achilia, locked in combat. It says, their match ended in a draw, with both released by the crowd. A rare honor, a rare respect. But admiration wasn't universal. Many elites saw gladiatrices as a disgrace, a symptom of Rome's decadence. Seneca and Juvenal sneered at them, calling them unnatural. Even emperors eventually banned the practice altogether, not because it was too violent, but because it was too embarrassing to the Roman sense of order. Still, for a moment in time, these women walked the same paths. They learned to fight, to bleed, to endure. And when they stepped into the arena, they turned heads. Not just because they were female, but because they were formidable. They didn't wear the same heavy armor. Often, they were more exposed, bare-armed, sometimes bare-chested, adding a sexualized edge to the violence. Rome liked its scandals spicy. And yet, beneath the showmanship, the same brutal truths applied. They had to train. They had to kill. They were cheered and jeered. And when they lost, they bled the same color. It wasn't about progress. It was about performance. But even in that twisted context, something powerful happened. Women who had been silenced, enslaved, or forgotten were suddenly seen, not as mothers, wives, or servants, but as fighters, as warriors, as something Rome didn't know how to categorize. And for those brief, flashing moments on the sand, they weren't victims. They were legends. But they didn't get special treatment. When they were wounded, they were patched up. When they were broken, they were replaced. Because in the arena, it didn't matter who you were, only that you were worth watching. And behind every battle, every slash and scream, there was someone watching closely. Not a spectator, not a senator, but a man with a scalpel. And his job wasn't to save you. It was to stitch you back together just enough for the next fight. If you survived the arena, you didn't walk out untouched. You walked out broken, bleeding, bruised. And waiting for you wasn't rest. It was a man with a needle, a clamp, and a terrifyingly steady hand. The medicus. Gladiator schools kept their own doctors, not out of compassion, but necessity. These fighters were investments. If you snapped a wrist, tore a ligament, or took a blade to the gut, the lanista wanted you patched up fast, not for comfort, but for profit. So what did ancient medicine look like when your rib cage was cracked open and you still had a match next week? Crude, but not clueless. Roman doctors knew how to clean wounds. They used vinegar, wine, and even honey to disinfect. They boiled their tools. They shaved hair from around cuts. They stitched torn flesh with linen thread or metal wire. They splinted broken limbs with wooden braces and wrapped sprains in tight bandages soaked in herbs like comfrey and yarrow. For pain, they had options. Willow bark, which contains a natural form of aspirin, poppy extract opium, strong wine mixed with myrrh. But anesthesia? Forget it. You were awake, sometimes biting leather, sometimes biting your own tongue. And it wasn't just about surviving wounds. It was about returning to the arena as fast as possible. If a doctor could reduce your recovery time by a week, he was worth his weight in gold. Some Medici became specialists, learning to recognize which injuries were lethal and which just looked bad. A deep thigh cut? Bloody, but survivable. A stomach wound? Almost always fatal. Head trauma? Toss a coin. There are records of skull surgeries, trepanations where chunks of fractured bone were removed to relieve pressure after a blow. Some patients survived. Others didn't even make it to the table. And if you were too far gone, you weren't mourned. You were stripped of your armor, your weapon, and your value. Burned or buried in a shallow grave, name scratched on a tile. Maybe your brothers from the ludus chipped in for a proper send-off. Maybe not. But if you did survive, if the medic worked fast, and the wound didn't fester, then you went back into training. Scarred, slower, but alive. Sometimes, the crowd loved the scars. They were proof you'd been tested. Proof you belonged in the sand. There are even records of disabled gladiators continuing to fight, missing eyes, mangled ears, crooked limbs. They adapted, they compensated. And the audience respected it, or at least they found it exciting. Because nothing thrilled a Roman like a wounded man refusing to die. And yet, for all their toughness, gladiators weren't invincible. They limped, they coughed up blood, they aged quickly. That's why some started taking matters into their own hands. They made poultices from ash and vinegar. They rubbed oils into their joints. They cracked joints back into place the old-fashioned way with a friend and a wooden bench. Their bodies became blueprints of pain. They learned themselves where they were weakest, how to protect an old wound, how to take a hit without showing it. Because if the crowd saw weakness, the editor might not wait for the next fight to finish you off. But there was another danger, one more invisible than the sword. And it came in the form of admiration, lust, obsession. Because the closer you got to death, the more people wanted you. And soon, you weren't just a fighter. You were a fantasy. They watched you bleed. They watched you win. And then they watched you with something else entirely in their eyes. Desire. To the Roman public, a gladiator wasn't just a fighter. He was a celebrity, a sex symbol, a forbidden fantasy carved from muscle and danger. There were scrolls of poetry written about them, love letters thrown into the arena, perfume jars supposedly filled with sweat from victorious champions sold in marketplaces for absurd amounts of money. And while senators debated law and virtue in the forum, their wives and daughters whispered about the man who had bested a retiarius with a single blow, the one with the jagged scar across his chest, the one who bowed with just the right amount of arrogance. In the Roman mind, the allure of a gladiator was tied directly to death. He wasn't just strong, he was doomed, and that made him irresistible. The philosopher Seneca once complained about noble women sneaking into the barracks at night, offering bribes just to spend a few moments with their favorite fighters. It wasn't always about love. Sometimes it was just status. Sleeping with a champion gave a woman or a man a taste of danger without ever stepping into the arena. And the gladiators? They weren't saints. Some reveled in the attention. Others saw it as a way to gain favors, food, freedom, or forgiveness from powerful lovers. A few became the kept men of wealthy Romans, showered with gifts in exchange for loyalty. But there was a darker side to this admiration. Gladiators were also slaves, objects. They were desired for their bodies, yes, but rarely seen as equals. Their charm was part of the same performance that bloodied the sand. And when the show ended, so did the affection. There are stories of gladiators being stabbed in bed, either by jealous spouses or disappointed fans. Others were publicly shamed for daring to believe that love might earn them a way out. Because Rome was a paradox, it worshipped its killers, and it scorned them the moment they stopped killing. Still, some tried to make love real love amidst the blood and dust. Some took wives, some had children, some carved their beloveds' names into the walls of their cells. And when they died, those same partners wept in the stands, ignored by the crowd. forgotten as the next match began. But for a brief, burning moment, a gladiator could be everything. A warrior, a lover, a god, just long enough to be remembered. But love wasn't the only emotion the gladiators stirred. Sometimes, they inspired something more dangerous. A fire that didn't ask for applause. It demanded freedom. No chains last forever. Not even in Rome. Because eventually, someone fought back. Not for sport, not for show, but for freedom. And his name was Spartacus. You've heard the name maybe from a movie, maybe from a meme, but the real story? It's raw, relentless, and far more terrifying than fiction. Spartacus wasn't born a gladiator. He was a Thracian, a soldier, captured and enslaved by Rome, sold to a ludus in Capua, where he trained to fight, to kill, to entertain. But Spartacus didn't just learn how to fight. He learned how to plan. In 73 BCE, he and around 70 other gladiators made their move. Using kitchen tools, knives, skewers, whatever they could grab, they broke out of their school, overpowered the guards, and fled into the countryside. They expected to die. Instead, they started a revolution. Other slaves heard what had happened, and they joined. By the hundreds, then thousands. Within months, Spartacus commanded an army not of trained soldiers, but of former slaves, gladiators, farmers, shepherds, people who had nothing left to lose. They defeated Roman legions, again and again. Tactically, brutally, brilliantly. Spartacus didn't just want escape. He wanted justice. And for a time, he had it. But Rome doesn't forget. And Rome does not forgive. The Senate sent Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, to crush the uprising. He brought discipline, manpower, and a message. This rebellion would not stand. Spartacus fought to the end. In 71 BCE, he made his final stand in southern Italy. Outnumbered, surrounded, and still he charged into battle, sword raised high. He died on the field. His body was never found. But Rome's revenge was very visible. 6,000 of Spartacus's followers were captured and crucified, one by one, along the Appian Way, the main road into Rome. A grotesque warning stretching over 100 miles. A forest of agony. The rebellion was over. But the fear it planted? That lingered. Because if one gladiator could ignite a war, what might others do? After Spartacus, Rome tightened the leash. Gladiator schools were watched more closely. Fights were more controlled. Rebellion became myth, something whispered, not planned. And still, every man in the sand dreamed of breaking free. Maybe not by war, maybe not by blood, but by surviving, by winning, by earning the ultimate prize, the ludus, a simple wooden sword, useless in a real fight. But in Rome, it meant freedom. It didn't shine. It wasn't sharp. It couldn't pierce armor or draw blood. But in the eyes of a gladiator, the ludus, a plain wooden sword, was more valuable than gold. Because the ludus meant freedom. You didn't get it for killing the most men. You didn't get it for being the fastest or the strongest. You got it for surviving, for enduring, for entertaining. Some fought a dozen matches, some fought 50. Each time they stepped into the arena knowing one bad turn, one slip, one missed block could be the end. And yet a few managed to rise above it. They became favorites. They thrilled the crowds. They made the editors rich and the Lanisti proud. And eventually, sometimes, they were granted a ludus. It was handed to them in front of the crowd. A ceremony. A moment. A gift. The roar of tens of thousands shaking the walls. The emperor nodding in approval. The ludus was both symbol and contract. You've given Rome enough blood. You may live as a free man. And what happened next? Some walked away and never looked back. They took new names, opened taverns, disappeared into quiet towns. After years of screams and steel, they wanted only silence. Others became trainers, doctores, staying behind to teach the next generation. They passed on their skills, their tricks, their warnings. They remembered every mistake that nearly killed them and taught their students not to repeat it. And a rare few? They came back. By choice. Not because they had to, because they missed it. Because out there, beyond the arena, they were just men. But in the arena, they were immortal. Names carved in stone, faces painted on amphorae, legends in the eyes of children reenacting fights in alleyways. There was risk, yes, but there was glory. And in Rome, a city built on stories, sometimes glory was worth more than breath. But the ludus wasn't always the end. Some who received it were still called back. For special matches, for exhibitions, or simply because a powerful man snapped his fingers and said, "I want him." And if you refused, you might lose everything, even your hard-won freedom. Because in the end, the arena always had the final word. Even when you left it, part of you stayed, buried in the sand, etched in the scars, echoing in the roar of a crowd that never truly went silent. And when you were gone, the games didn't stop. The next name was called. The next gate opened. Because the arena was never about one man. It was about the spectacle. And Rome always demanded more, long after the blood dried, long after the roar faded into memory. The legacy of the gladiator endured, not just in bones buried beneath ancient stone, not just in crumbling amphitheaters swallowed by time, but in something far more powerful, memory. Rome fell. The empire crumbled. But the gladiator never left us. His shadow walks through our stories, our films, our fantasies. He lives in paintings, in novels, in video games. We can't let him go, because deep down, we still admire him. Why? Because the gladiator was more than a killer. He was a symbol of defiance, of survival, of what it means to be pushed to the edge of humanity and still fight back. We remember the agony, yes, the chains, the brutality, the cruelty of a system that turned men into monsters for applause. But we also remember the willpower, the man who stood up again and again, who faced death not once, but dozens of times, who kept breathing when the world begged him to stop. And maybe, just maybe, we see a part of ourselves in him. Because aren't we all in some way trying to survive an arena? A world that watches, that judges, that demands performance, that applauds success and turns away at weakness. We fight too, for recognition, for freedom, for something more. And just like him, we don't always get to choose our battles. Sometimes we're thrown into them. Sometimes the gate opens, and we have no choice but to step forward. But when we do, we remember the gladiator. Not because he was perfect, not because he was a hero, but because he endured. So tonight, as you turn off the lights, as the crowd in your mind quiets, as the sand settles, remember this. You come from a long line of survivors. And no matter what arena you're facing, keep standing, keep swinging, and when they hand you your wooden sword, Your moment of peace. Raise it high. You earned it.